Welcome back, Night Wanderer. Tonight we travel beyond the veils of candlelit corridors, into the hush of midnight chambers, and behind the heavy tapestries of royal courts. There, in the flicker of torchlight and the echo of whispered vows, passion simmered, and sometimes ignited wars. You've heard tales of knights and ladies, of courtly love and troubadours, but what happens when that love is forbidden, when it challenges the crown, the church, or even God? This is not a fairy tale. This is the other side of history, the one embroidered with scandal, betrayal, and desire so powerful it tore through laws and loyalties alike. Behind every gilded throne, a heart once raced for the wrong person, and sometimes, that heartbeat was louder than any royal decree. Over the next 2 hours, you'll hear the stories they tried to silence. Affairs that didn't just break hearts, they broke empires. Illicit romances that spiraled into revolts. Adulteries that invited assassination. Secret trysts that fractured dynasties. These were the loves that kings died for. The liaisons that rewrote laws. The kisses that cursed bloodlines. So dim the lights, wrap yourself in warmth, let the hum of your surroundings settle. And if you enjoy these whispered walks through the shadows of history, do take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and drop a comment. Tell me where you're listening from, and what century you'd risk it all for love in. Because tonight, we remember the passion that dared to bloom where it should not have. Welcome to the forbidden. Let us begin. In the tapestry of medieval Europe, few women gleamed as brightly, or as dangerously, as Eleanor of Aquitaine. She was not merely a duchess, not simply a queen. She was a force of nature wrapped in silk, crowned in power, and carved into legend by her own audacity. Born in 1122, Eleanor was heiress to the vast and wealthy Duchy of Aquitaine, stretching across modern-day southwestern France. From the moment she entered the world, she was no ordinary girl. Trained in courtly arts, steeped in the poetry of the troubadours, and fiercely intelligent, Eleanor was destined to be more than a pawn in the chessboard of dynasties, but no one could have predicted how her desires, political and personal, would unravel the order of Europe itself. A royal marriage and a restless heart. At just 15 years old, Eleanor was married to Louis VII, King of France. The union was political, as so many were, designed to fuse the power of France with the riches of Aquitaine. But Louis was no match for Eleanor. He was pious, reserved, almost monastic in his devotion to the church. She was bold, curious, sensual, and impatient with the cloistered confines of the French court. Where he sought the will of God, she sought the pulse of life. The two were mismatched in every possible way. Yet they reigned, uneasily, for over a decade. They even went on crusade together in 1147, a nearly unthinkable act for a queen at the time. But Eleanor refused to remain idle, while Louis ventured east. She rode at the head of her own retinue, dressed, some whispered scandalously, like an Amazon. While Louis prayed for salvation, Eleanor scandalized the Holy Lands. It was during this time that the whispers began. The alleged affair with Uncle Raymond in Antioch, far from Paris and papal eyes, Eleanor reunited with her uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, the charismatic and gallant Prince of Antioch. He was everything Louis was not: dashing, worldly, fluent in politics and poetry, and he welcomed Eleanor not just as kin, but as queen, friend, and equal. The two grew close. Too close, according to the king's entourage. Chronicles of the time tell us Louis became jealous, furious even. He feared that Eleanor and Raymond were lovers. The rumors flew from tent to tent like wildfire. Some said they met at night, beneath the stars. Others whispered that Raymond had seduced the queen in his palace gardens. Some claimed he boasted of her beauty in ways no uncle should. There is no proof, only suggestion. But in the world of medieval courts, suggestion was often enough to destroy reputations. Louis tried to separate them. Eleanor refused. She announced that she wished to remain in Antioch, even as her husband prepared to leave. The king, enraged and humiliated, forced her to return to France against her will. Their marriage never recovered. A bold divorce, a bolder choice. Soon after returning from the crusade, Eleanor sought an annulment. In 1152, her marriage to Louis was dissolved on the grounds of consanguinity, a common excuse used when the church wanted to end a union while preserving reputations. But the real reason was far more human. Eleanor and Louis despised one another. The moment she was free, Eleanor did the unthinkable. She married again. But not just anyone. She chose Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy, and heir to the English throne. A man 11 years her junior. A fiery, ambitious, restless young noble, with a ruthless streak and a burning desire to rule, it was a love match. But it was also a power play. Within 2 years, Henry became King Henry II of England, and Eleanor, once Queen of France, was now Queen of England. It was a move that stunned Christendom. In a single stroke, Eleanor transferred her vast duchy and loyalty from the French crown to its greatest rival. Her choice redrew the map of Europe and began a geopolitical rivalry that would last for centuries. Love, betrayal, and rebellion. But Eleanor's story didn't end with her second coronation. In many ways, it had only begun. Her marriage to Henry was passionate and volatile. Together, they had 8 children, including 2 future kings, Richard the Lionheart and King John. But Henry was not a faithful husband. He took mistresses openly. Most famously, Rosamund Clifford, whose Fair Rosamund nickname couldn't mask the Queen's hatred. Eleanor, never one to suffer humiliation in silence, eventually turned against her husband. In 1173, she did the unthinkable again. She encouraged her sons to rebel against their father. The Queen of England, mother of princes, became a traitor to her king. The rebellion failed. Eleanor was captured, imprisoned, silenced. For 16 years, Henry kept her confined in various castles, only allowing her to appear at court on rare occasions. Her passion for power, and for vengeance, had cost her everything. But fate, once again, was not finished with Eleanor of Aquitaine. The Queen returns in 1189, Henry II died. Their son, Richard the Lionheart, ascended the throne. And the first act of his reign, he released his mother from captivity. Eleanor emerged from the shadows not as a victim, but as a queen reborn. She became a crucial advisor to Richard, ruling in his stead during his absence on crusade, and later guiding the early reign of her youngest son, King John. Well into her 70s, Eleanor negotiated treaties, arranged royal marriages, and maintained alliances. She outlived 2 kings, several of her own children, and the poisonous rumors that once surrounded her name. Legacy of a forbidden queen. So was her affair with Raymond of Poitiers real? Historians still debate it. But what cannot be denied is that Eleanor's heart, her desire, shaped kingdoms. Whether driven by lust, love, or liberation, her choices broke traditions, crossed borders, and defied kings. She was excommunicated, exiled, and erased by some scribes, only to re-emerge stronger, wiser, and more enduring. In the end, Eleanor of Aquitaine was not destroyed by forbidden love. She destroyed the rules that sought to contain it. In the hallowed halls of 12th century Paris, where theology and logic clashed like titans, and the church ruled both minds and morals, a forbidden love ignited between a brilliant philosopher and his gifted student. Their passion would shatter reputations, ignite scandal across Christendom, and end not in marriage or joy, but in mutilation and lifelong exile from each other's arms. This is the tale of Peter Abelard and Heloise. Lovers bound not only by desire, but by intellect and by tragedy. The philosopher and the prodigy Peter Abelard was already a star. Born around 1079, Abelard was a scholar who challenged the rigid dogma of the church with his daring logic and brilliant mind. By the time he arrived in Paris, he was a rock star of medieval academia, eloquent, provocative, and widely admired by students and enemies alike. And then came Heloise. She was young, possibly in her late teens, but not naive. Raised in the household of her uncle Canon Fulbert, she was a rare woman of letters. Heloise read Latin, mastered Greek, and devoured philosophy. In a time when most women were expected to remain illiterate and silent, she was already a legend in Parisian intellectual circles. Abelard noticed her brilliance, but he also noticed her beauty. And so, he devised a plan. He moved into Fulbert's home under the guise of tutoring Heloise. Her uncle, eager for his niece to have the best education, agreed. What followed was not merely a seduction. It was a collision. Of minds, of hearts, of bodies. A forbidden romance unfolds by candlelight. Abelard taught Heloise the nuances of Aristotle and Christian doctrine. But between the pages of Plato and prayers, they exchanged glances, stolen touches, and eventually, confessions. Their love became legend almost immediately. Even Abelard later wrote of their passion in his autobiography. More words were devoted to love than to reading, and more kissing than teaching. Their affair burned hot and fast. They met in secret, even in Fulbert's house. they wrote love letters that were more poetry than prose. And when the inevitable happened, when Eloise became pregnant, everything unraveled. To preserve her reputation, Abelard sent Heloise to his sister's home in Brittany, where she gave birth to their son, Astrolabe, a name that itself was a quiet rebellion, echoing knowledge over tradition. When Fulbert discovered the deception, he was livid. But Abelard, still deeply in love, offered a compromise. He would marry Eloise in secret. She agreed reluctantly. She feared marriage would ruin Abelard's career, and she was right. Even so, they wed, quietly, without public announcement. Still, the truth leaked. And Fulbert's rage turned dark. A brutal punishment. In the dead of night, Fulbert orchestrated a revenge so savage it would echo across history. A group of hired men broke into Abelard's chamber while he slept. There, with no chance to escape or defend himself, they attacked. And they castrated him. It was not just a physical assault. It was a symbolic execution of his masculinity, his defiance, and his passion. The message was clear. No man, no matter how brilliant, could defy the church, the family, and the social order with impunity. Abelard's career was ruined. His body was broken. And worst of all, the love that had defined him was now a source of public shame. Cloistered lives, divided hearts. In the aftermath, Abelard did not turn to Heloise. He turned to God. He became a monk at the Abbey of Saint-Denis, and Heloise, devastated but obedient, entered the convent at Argenteuil, effectively becoming a nun. Their love, once electric, was now imprisoned in separate sanctuaries. But silence never truly came. Years passed, decades even. And then, the letters began. The letters that defied time. Their correspondence, preserved across the centuries, is among the most heartbreaking in history. Heloise, far from a willing nun, poured her grief and longing onto the page. God knows I never sought anything in you but yourself. I sought no marriage, no vows, only you. She accused Abelard of abandoning her emotionally, of seeking salvation, while she remained mired in passion and memory. Abelard, now older and consumed by guilt, wrote back with a voice torn between remorse and repression. Their letters danced between theology and desire, between submission and sorrow. They debated love, power, faith, and the body. Even separated by years and monastic walls, their connection refused to die. Death, reunion, and whispered legacy. Abelard died in 1142. Heloise followed 20 years later. But even in death, they would not be parted. They were buried together, first at Paraclete, the abbey Eloise had led, and later, their bones were moved to Paris, where they lie side by side beneath a single stone. Even now, visitors to Père Lachaise Cemetery leave letters on their grave, messages of love, of loss, of longing. Their story resonates because it captures the eternal tension between love and duty, passion and punishment, the affair that redefined love. Unlike other medieval affairs, Abelard and Heloise didn't topple a kingdom, they didn't start wars or shift borders, but their love challenged something even greater: the Church's monopoly on desire, the assumption that women could not think and feel with equal intensity, and the belief that love was merely a political tool. They were punished for daring to feel deeply, but their story survived precisely because of how deeply they felt, and because sometimes, the greatest revolutions begin with a whisper between two lovers in the dark. Some love stories are too powerful to remain confined to truth. They transcend the borders of history, slip into the realm of myth, and linger for centuries in whispered tales and stained glass. So it is with the forbidden affair of Queen Guinevere and Sir Lancelot, a romance so potent, so damning, that it shattered the dream of Camelot and fractured the Round Table from within. Was it real? That depends on whom you ask. But the story's resonance, of love clashing with loyalty, of honor crumbling under passion, has echoed through every medieval hall since. And tonight, we slip behind the veils of legend to ask, what if the downfall of a kingdom began with a kiss? The dream of Camelot. Before there was scandal, there was hope. Camelot. A place of chivalry, justice, and equality. A court where noble knights gathered at a round table so no man would sit above another. And at the center of this golden age stood King Arthur, the once and future king, wise and just. Beside him stood Guinevere, his queen. Fair, elegant, intelligent. Chosen not just for her beauty but for her poise and lineage. Together, they were the embodiment of ideal rule. And then came Lancelot, the perfect knight. Enter the knight. Lancelot de Lac was no ordinary warrior. Raised by the Lady of the Lake, forged in magic and mystery, he arrived in Arthur's court a paragon of skill, loyalty and grace. He was brave in battle, humble in council, and utterly devoted to the king. But it was Guinevere who truly captured his soul. She too saw in Lancelot more than a knight. She saw a man torn between honor and yearning, a mirror of her own heart, which beat dutifully for her husband, but longed for something unspoken. Their love did not erupt in scandal overnight. It began in glances, in fleeting words, in the silent understanding of two people bound by roles they did not choose. Courtly love and quiet betrayal. Medieval poets spun the tale as one of courtly love, a sanitized phrase for a dangerous desire. In that world, it was almost expected that a knight would worship his queen from afar, that he might pine, serve and adore, without ever touching. But Lancelot and Guinevere crossed that invisible line. In secret gardens, in the hush of torchlit chambers, in letters passed under cloaks, the Queen of Camelot and her king's most trusted knight surrendered to passion. And with each stolen moment, the kingdom grew more fragile. She was called the She-Wolf of France, a title not born of rumor or superstition, but of fear, of a queen who dared to seize power in a world of kings, a woman who loved in secret, plotted in silence, and brought down an anointed sovereign with the flick of her jeweled fingers. Isabella of France was born into royalty, but she was no pawn. And when love came to her, it arrived not as a gentle flame, but as a fuse to a powder keg. This is the story of Isabella and Roger Mortimer, of a queen and her forbidden lover, of how their desire shook England to its core, and led to one of the most notorious regicides in medieval Europe. A loveless throne. Isabella was married at 12. The groom? Edward II of England, a king already crowned, but not yet fully in control. Their union was meant to cement peace between England and France, a delicate truce in an age of endless wars and shifting borders. But there was no peace in their marriage. Edward was distant, cold, and worse, devoted not to his wife but to a man, Piers Gaveston. A low-born knight, Gaveston had Edward's heart in a way Isabella never would. He dressed extravagantly, mocked the nobility, and held influence no royal favorite should. At court, whispers grew louder. Was the king in love with Gaveston? Isabella, still a girl, was humiliated. She watched as her husband ignored her, lavished gifts upon Gaveston, and even allowed him to carry royal honors that were hers by right. She was queen only in name. And England was watching. The rise and fall of favorites. The nobility hated Gaveston. Eventually, their hatred turned to violence. In 1312, a faction of barons captured and executed him, without trial. The king never forgave them, but he did not learn. He soon replaced Gaveston with new favorites, the Despencer family. Hugh Despencer the Younger became Edward's closest advisor, and, some believed, his lover. Isabella, now older and politically astute, watched in silence as the Despensers tightened their grip on England. They seized land, punished enemies, and even accused Isabella's own allies of treason. It was not just emotional betrayal now, it was political. The queen was being erased from power, until she vanished from court and began to plot. An English queen in exile in 1325, Isabella was sent to France to negotiate peace with her brother, King Charles IV. Edward had lost Gascony, and needed someone to restore the treaty. But once in France, Isabella refused to return. She denounced the Despensers, she refused to live with Edward. And most dangerously, she began gathering allies. Enter Roger Mortimer. A marcher lord from the Welsh borderlands, Mortimer had once rebelled against Edward, and been imprisoned in the Tower of London. But he escaped, in a cloak and dagger plot worthy of fiction, and fled to France. There, in the safety of Isabella's circle, their fates entwined. No one knows precisely when their romance began, but by 1326, it was undeniable. Letters, witnesses, political moves made in tandem. The queen and the exile had become lovers, and together, they would take the crown. The invasion of England. Isabella and Mortimer raised an army in France, bolstered by discontented English nobles and foreign mercenaries. Then, in a stunning act of rebellion, they landed on English shores. Edward II, isolated and blind to the scale of the revolt, fled. His allies deserted him. Even the people turned. In less than 2 months, the king was captured, and Isabella, once the silent queen, now ruled as regent, alongside Mortimer. They did not marry. That would have been too overt, too scandalous. But they shared power, and a bed. For a brief heady moment, they were the most powerful couple in England. A king's death in the shadows, Edward II was imprisoned at Berkeley Castle. Then, in 1327, news came. The king was dead. The official word claimed he had died of natural causes, but no one believed it. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said he was smothered. Others whispered something more grotesque, that a red-hot poker was used to preserve the appearance of an unmarked body. To this day the truth is unknown. But one fact remains. The death occurred while Isabella and Mortimer ruled. It was, by all definitions, regicide. The price of passion power, like love, is intoxicating. But in medieval England, both could turn lethal overnight. Isabella and Mortimer ruled for 4 years as regents for her son, Edward III. They lived luxuriously, some said extravagantly. They eliminated rivals, enriched themselves, and kept the young king firmly under their thumb. But Edward III was no child for long. In 1330, now just 17, he launched a coup. Mortimer was arrested and charged with treason. Within weeks, he was hanged, without trial. Isabella was spared execution. She was, after all, the king's mother. But she was stripped of power and sent into comfortable exile in Castle Rising, where she lived for nearly 30 years. She never took another lover. Legacy of the she-wolves. So why call her a she-wolf? Because she defied every expectation of a medieval queen. She took a lover, she raised an army, she overthrew a king. But she was not mad, not reckless. She was calculating, intelligent, and, at times, deeply wounded. Did she order Edward's death? Perhaps. Did she love Mortimer? Almost certainly. Did that love destroy a kingdom? Without a doubt. And in the quiet years of her exile, as she walked the stone halls of her manor and watched the rise of her son's golden reign, one wonders, did she ever look back? Did she dream of the fire that once burned in her heart? Or did she whisper his name, Roger, into the silence of her royal prison? It began with a glance. A queen sat on the throne. A king stood at her side. And across the court, a lady-in-waiting lowered her gaze and captured a crown. The affair between Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn is perhaps the most studied, debated, and dramatized of all medieval royal scandals. But strip away the dramas, the costumes, the beheadings that followed, and what remains is a devastating portrait of obsession. This was no simple dalliance. It was a storm of ego and desire so powerful, it split England from the Catholic Church, shattered centuries of tradition, and ultimately turned love into execution. A restless king, and a new temptation. By the late 1520s, Henry VIII had been married to Catherine of Aragon for nearly 20 years. She was a Spanish princess, noble, devout, and once beloved. But as the years dragged on without a male heir, Henry's frustration grew. Catherine had birthed several children, but only one survived, a daughter, Mary. And Henry, desperate for a son to secure the Tudor line, began to believe his marriage was cursed by God. Enter Anne Boleyn. She was not classically beautiful, but she was magnetic. Dark eyes, sharp wit, fierce intelligence. She had returned to court after years in France, carrying with her the sophistication and cunning of continental courts. Her sister, Mary Boleyn, had already been the king's mistress. But Anne? Anne refused to be a footnote. She would not be his mistress. If Henry wanted her, he would have to make her queen. The great Mater Henry became infatuated. He wrote her dozens of letters, full of longing, admiration, and eventually, rage at her resistance. She gave him just enough to keep him desperate. A touch, a smile, a whispered promise. And as his desire grew, so did his conviction that his marriage to Catherine must be annulled. He appealed to Pope Clement VII, arguing that his union with Catherine was invalid because she had been his brother's widow. But Catherine maintained they had never consummated her first marriage, and she had the moral weight of Europe behind her. The Pope, under pressure from Catherine's powerful nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, refused to grant the annulment. So Henry made a decision that would change history. If the Pope would not grant his divorce, he would remove the Pope's power altogether. Breaking with Rome over the next several years, Henry, with Anne always at his side, began to undermine the Catholic Church's authority in England. He declared himself head of the Church of England. He dissolved monasteries, seized lands, and punished those who remained loyal to Rome. This wasn't just a spiritual rebellion. It was political, financial, and deeply personal. In 1533, against all odds, he married Anne in secret. She was already pregnant. Soon after, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer declared Henry's marriage to Catherine void, and his marriage to Anne valid. Anne was crowned queen in a lavish ceremony, draped in gold and carrying the hopes of an entirely new religious order. She had won, or so it seemed, from desire to disdain. Anne gave birth later that year. But instead of the long-awaited male heir, she delivered a girl, Elizabeth. Henry was disappointed, but not yet defeated. He believed a son would come. But over the next 2 years Anne suffered multiple miscarriages. Her wit, once irresistible, now grated on the king. Her political ambition, once thrilling, now felt dangerous, and her enemies at court, many loyal to the memory of Queen Catherine, whispered constantly in Henry's ear. Soon, his eyes began to wander to Jane Seymour, and Anne, once the hunter, now felt the trap closing around her. The fall. By 1536 the tide had turned. Anne was arrested on charges of adultery, incest and treason, accusations many historians now believe were fabricated or wildly exaggerated. She was accused of seducing several men at court, including her own brother. The trials were rushed, the evidence flimsy, but the outcome was inevitable. Anne was found guilty. On May 19, 1536, she was executed by a French swordsman, specially brought in to give her a swift and clean death. She knelt on the scaffold at the Tower of London, prayed, and died with dignity. Henry did not attend. Instead, he celebrated his engagement to Jane Seymour just days later. Legacy of a Queen. Anne Boleyn's story is not merely one of seduction gone wrong. She was intelligent, reform-minded, and deeply involved in the political and religious transformation of England. She championed Protestant ideas, patronized scholars, and reshaped the very structure of English power. But she also paid the price for playing in a man's world with a man's tools. Ambition, influence, sex, power. She used them all, and for a moment, she won. But in the end, Henry's obsession cooled into cruelty, and Anne's rise became her ruin. Yet her legacy endured, in her daughter, Elizabeth I, who would become one of the greatest monarchs in history. A queen born of forbidden love. The affair that bled a kingdom. Henry and Anne's affair was not just scandalous, it was apocalyptic. It dismantled centuries of Catholic authority, sparked rebellions, and created a religious divide that still echoes today. It began with flirtation and ended with a sword, but in between was revolution. History often forgets royal mistresses. They're remembered in footnotes, if at all. Names whispered in passing, painted into the margins of chronicles written by men obsessed with crowns. But Jane Shore refused to stay in the margins. She was neither queen nor noble. She had no armies, no titles, no inheritance. What she had was charm, wit and beauty so luminous that it pulled one of England's most powerful kings into her orbit. Yet Jane's story is more than a tale of seduction. It is a cautionary fable of what happens when a woman becomes too visible in a world that prefers her silent, and how love, once spent, can curdle into punishment. The King of Charm, Edward IV, was the golden lion of the Yorkist dynasty. Tall, broad-shouldered and famously handsome, he was not the brooding schemer like his cousin Warwick the Kingmaker, nor the icy tactician like his brother Richard. He was a warrior king and a lover, driven by appetite and charm. Crowned during the brutal Wars of the Roses, Edward clawed his way to the throne not once but twice, facing exile, betrayal and battle, only to emerge stronger. And when the fighting paused, his hunger turned elsewhere. To women. Edward was notorious for his affairs. He took mistresses freely, even seducing women in disguise. But among them all, one stood apart: Jane Shore. The merchant's daughter, born Elizabeth Lambert around 1445. Jane was the daughter of a prosperous London merchant, not nobility, but respectable and well-educated. She married young, but her beauty quickly attracted the attention of powerful men. After her marriage was annulled, likely under pressure, she caught the eye of Edward IV, and in a court filled with scheming nobles and fickle alliances, Jane stood out, not just for her looks, but for her mind. She was clever, sharp-tongued, and possessed a kind of moral center rare among the king's circle. She didn't use her position to amass land or titles. Instead, she pleaded for mercy for political prisoners. She gave alms to the poor. Even chroniclers who loathed Edward admitted a reluctant respect for her. She wasn't just a mistress, she was beloved. And when Edward grew tired of other women, he kept Jane by his side. The king dies, and the court turns cold, but love, especially royal love, is never safe. In 1483, Edward IV died suddenly. His son and heir, Edward V, was only 12 years old. The boy was placed under the protection of his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and Richard wasted no time. He imprisoned Edward V and his brother in the Tower of London. They were never seen again. Richard declared them illegitimate, claiming that Edward IV had been secretly married before his union with Queen Elizabeth Woodville, making all his children unlawful heirs. And who was blamed as a witness to Edward's alleged prior affairs? Jane Shore. The mistress on trial. Suddenly, Jane found herself at the center of a political storm. She was arrested, not for adultery but for harlotry and sorcery, as if her influence over the king had been some unnatural enchantment. It was a tactic as old as power itself. When a king dies, the woman closest to his pillow becomes the most convenient target. She was dragged through the streets barefoot, dressed in nothing but a thin penitent robe, the once adored mistress now humiliated before the people who once cheered her beauty. But Jane did not beg, she did not break. Even in disgrace, chroniclers noted her composure and quiet dignity. From prison to pardon, imprisoned in Ludgate, Jane's fate seemed sealed. But fortune, fickle as ever, turned once more. A royal official named Thomas Lynham, moved by her resilience, fell in love with her. Despite her ruined reputation, he petitioned to marry her. It was an astonishing gesture, one that might have ended his career. But Richard III, perhaps weary of scandal, or indifferent to Jane by now, allowed it. She was freed. She lived quietly. And then, like many women of history, she vanished from record. But the myth remained. A ghost of the court, Jane Shore, was no Anne Boleyn. She didn't change the church or challenge the state. But her name haunted English memory. Because she represented something dangerous, a woman who dared to matter at court not through birth or marriage, but through intelligence and allure. Her love affair didn't destroy a kingdom on its own. But in the bloody years that followed Edward IV's death, in the rise of Richard III, the mystery of the princes in the Tower, and the eventual rise of the Tudors, Jane's name was always present. Always whispered. A shadow behind the throne. Love in the crosshairs of power. Jane Shore's story is not just about beauty or seduction. It is about proximity to power, and how easily affection can turn into accusation. Edward IV adored her, but when he died, no one protected her. That is the true tragedy of courtly love in the Middle Ages. It shines only in the king's gaze, and when that gaze fades, so too does the woman who once seemed invincible. But Jane did not vanish into silence. She left behind a legend, one not of riches or conquest, but of resilience, the mistress who endured. In the early 1300s, the Capetian dynasty ruled France with a grip of iron and ceremony. King Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, was no romantic. His fairness was not of temperament, but of physical appearance. He was cold, calculating, and ruthless. He had burned the Knights Templar. He had defied the Pope. He had tightened royal power in a way no French king before him had dared. And yet, within his own palace walls, his legacy would be undone, not by war or conspiracy, but by scandal, by love letters, by secret trysts, by women who dared to choose passion over protocol. This is the story of Joan I of Navarre, Philip's wife and queen, and the scandal that ensnared their daughters-in-law, forever remembered as the Tour de Nesle affair. A family of kings and queens, Philip and Joan were a powerful royal couple. She was Queen Regnant of Navarre in her own right, bringing territory and prestige into the French crown. Together, they had 4 children who lived into adulthood, 3 sons who would all, eventually become kings of France, and a daughter, Isabella, who would become Queen of England. Their court was strict, ceremonious and deeply hierarchical. Philip demanded obedience, from his nobles, from the clergy, and especially from his family. But while Philip expanded his power, and Joan governed Navarre, their court grew restive. The younger generation, raised in silk and ritual, chafed under the king's watchful eye, especially his sons' wives. A queen's suspicion, it was Isabella of France, the only daughter of Philip and Joan, who lit the match. By 1313, Isabella was living in England, married to King Edward II. On a royal visit to France, she gifted embroidered purses to her sisters-in-law, Margaret, Blanche and Joan, all married to her brothers. Later, she saw 2 Norman knights, Philippe and Gautier d'Aunay, openly displaying those same purses in public. Why would low-ranking knights have personal items belonging to the wives of French princes? Isabella began to suspect adultery. And in a royal court where infidelity could call into question the legitimacy of heirs, this was treason, the Tordonnel. In 1314, Philip launched a secret investigation. Spies followed the knights, servants were questioned, and then, the most damning evidence emerged. The lovers had been meeting the royal daughters-in-law inside the Tordonnel, a tower on the banks of the Seine, used for quiet liaisons far from palace eyes. The trysts were not subtle. Servants described lavish banquets, drunken nights, and long hours behind locked doors. Margaret, wife of the heir Louis, was the most implicated. Blanche, wife of Charles, was also accused. Only Joan, wife of Philip's middle son, was more ambiguously involved. She admitted to knowing about the affairs, but denied participating. The fallout was swift and brutal. Punishment and death. The knights were arrested, tortured, and forced to confess. They admitted to sleeping with the princesses, repeatedly over several years. They were convicted of lèse-majesté, the crime of offending royal dignity. Their execution was public and horrifying. They were flayed alive, mutilated, and beheaded. Their corpses were left to rot on the gallows as a warning to all of France. This is what happens to those who touch the king's blood. The princesses were imprisoned. Margaret and Blanche were shaved bald, dressed in coarse wool, and locked away in fortress convents for life. Margaret, once heir apparent to the French crown, died 2 years later, likely from neglect or abuse. Joan, whose involvement was murkier, was imprisoned but later released, thanks in part to her husband, who defended her innocence. Philip the Fair did not flinch. He had crushed the Templars. And now, he had crushed a scandal in his own house. But his dynasty would not survive the stain. Philip IV died shortly after the scandal. Perhaps from a stroke, perhaps from the stress of holding his kingdom together through outrage and upheaval. One by one, his sons became kings, and died without male heirs. Louis X ruled for just 2 years. His daughter, Joan, daughter of disgraced Margaret, was barred from the throne, possibly due to the lingering doubt around her legitimacy. Charles IV, the last son, died childless in 1328. And just like that, the direct Capetian line ended. The crown passed to a cousin, the House of Valois, and eventually, through tangled alliances, to the House of Lancaster in England, helping lay the groundwork for the 100 Years' War. All from a scandal that began with a glance and a purse. Was it all true? Historians debate the validity of the confessions. The Dornay brothers were tortured. Confessions under pain rarely tell the full truth. The motives may have been political. The charges may have been exaggerated by Isabella to damage her sisters-in-law, but one thing is certain, the scandal was real, and the punishment was public. In medieval Europe, queens were expected to be silent, fertile, and loyal. Love was not part of the job. And desire? That was treason. The Tordonnel affair proved that women, especially royal women, could bring down kingdoms, not by war, but by wanting. Legacy of Joan I and the lost queens. Joan I of Navarre died before the scandal unfolded, spared the heartbreak of seeing her daughters-in-law dragged through the mud. Her legacy, like her husband's, was overshadowed by the drama of their children's downfall. But the story lived on. In plays, in chronicles, in legend. The tower where the affairs allegedly took place became infamous. The phrase, tour de Nesle, became shorthand in French for royal scandal, and the lesson echoed across courts for generations. A queen's desire, no matter how secret, could be used to erase her bloodline. All it took was love, or the appearance of it. In the cold halls of medieval Europe, where thrones were bartered like cattle and love was seldom asked for, or expected, a marriage forged in fire and rebellion managed to outlast both war and scandal. It created a dynasty, but nearly tore England apart in the process. This is the story of Empress Matilda and Geoffrey Plantagenet. She was the only surviving legitimate child of a king. He was a teenager with golden hair, a flaming temper, and an iron will. Together, they created the Plantagenet line, the longest ruling dynasty in English history. But before the birth of kings, there was a love affair that challenged everything. The Empress Returns. Matilda was no ordinary woman. Born in 1102, she was the daughter of King Henry I of England. As a child, she was married off to Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, a title that made her empress. She lived in grand halls, wore imperial robes, and walked among the most powerful men in Christendom. But when her husband died in 1125, Matilda returned to her father's court in England, no longer an empress, but still a royal force to be reckoned with. She was proud, brilliant, and used to command. She didn't suffer fools, and she had no intention of playing the role of a quiet widow. Her father had no surviving sons. And so, in a move almost unthinkable for the time, King Henry I named Matilda as his heir to the throne. But England's barons were not ready to kneel to a woman. To secure her position, she would need more than a claim. She would need an alliance. Enter Geoffrey Plantagenet. Geoffrey of Anjou was just 15 when his betrothal to Matilda was arranged. She was 25. And she was livid. She saw Geoffrey as a child. Worse, a French child from a region traditionally hostile to Normandy in England. The marriage was political, forged to bind Normandy and Anjou into one powerful unit. But for Matilda, it felt like a demotion, from empress to nursemaid. Still, she obeyed her father's command. The two were married in 1128, and slowly, something changed. Fire meets steel. Geoffrey was no ordinary youth. Despite his age, he was a bold, charismatic figure, tall, strong, and impossibly handsome. He was fond of rich clothing, horses, and tournaments. He had a quick wit and an even quicker temper. But what truly set him apart was his ambition. He didn't want to be Matilda's consort. He wanted to rule beside her, as her equal. And somehow, in the clash of egos, respect began to grow. Their early years were rocky, marked by separations and quarrels, but the passion was undeniable. When they came together, it was explosive. And over time, what began as resentment evolved into partnership. Matilda did not bend, and Geoffrey refused to break. Together, they built a future. A dynasty is born between 1133 and 1136. Matilda gave birth to 3 sons. The eldest was named Henry, after her father. He would one day become Henry II, the first Plantagenet king of England. But their domestic bliss was brief. In 1135, King Henry I died suddenly, without formally securing Matilda's claim to the throne. And everything unraveled. The anarchy begins despite Matilda's claim, and the oath sworn to her. Her cousin Stephen of Blois seized the English throne. He was crowned within weeks. England was thrown into chaos. Matilda, with Geoffrey's support, launched a war to claim what was hers. It was not a swift campaign. It was brutal, drawn out, and came to be known as the Anarchy, a period where law collapsed, famine spread, and barons fought like wolves over scraps of territory. Geoffrey remained in France, securing Normandy. Matilda crossed the Channel in secret and led armies against Stephen. She captured him. She ruled as Lady of the English. But she was never crowned. The people rejected her. Too proud, too foreign, too female. Eventually she was forced to retreat. The legacy they forged. Though Matilda never wore the crown, her son would. Geoffrey and Matilda's firstborn, Henry, grew up to be everything they weren't. Diplomatic yet decisive, a master of war and law. In 1154, after years of bloodshed, he ascended the throne as King Henry II of England. It was the fulfillment of everything Matilda and Geoffrey had fought for. Their love, imperfect, tempestuous, and often strained, had birthed a dynasty that would rule England for over 300 years. The Plantagenets. From Henry II to Richard the Lionheart. From King John to Edward III. Their blood would dominate the pages of medieval history. A love that changed history. Matilda and Geoffrey were not lovers in the romantic sense. There were no love letters, no poems, no wistful sighs. But theirs was a medieval love. A partnership forged in steel and fire. They defied expectations, gender roles, and geography. And though they spent more time apart than together, their ambitions were shared. Their story was one of survival. Of passion without tenderness. Of power earned and passed on. And in the end, they succeeded. Their child would inherit not just a throne, but a legacy of resilience, will, and rebellion. And that legacy was born in a marriage no one expected to matter. Some love stories are whispered, not written. They survive in letters edged with restraint, in alliances that burn too bright, in betrayals that feel personal, because they are. Richard the Lionheart, King of England. Philip II Augustus, King of France. Rivals, crusaders, brothers in arms. And, perhaps, something more. Though the truth of their relationship remains cloaked in ambiguity, the intensity with which they allied, and then turned on each other, has led many historians to ask, were they more than just political bedfellows? Was this a forbidden medieval love affair that not only defied church and crown, but fractured empires. The Golden Crusader Richard I of England was everything a king was supposed to be, at least in legend. He was born in 1157 to the infamous Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, and spent most of his youth in Aquitaine, speaking French and rebelling against his father. He was tall, charismatic, and a genius in battle. He became a warrior king so admired that even his enemies spoke of him with awe. But for all his greatness, Richard was a mystery when it came to love. He took no mistresses, sired no known illegitimate children, married late, and without enthusiasm. His affections were rarely spoken aloud. But in Philip of France, he found a mirror and a match. An alliance forged in fire. Philip II of France was younger than Richard, but equally ambitious. He sought to reclaim French lands held by the English crown and strengthen the monarchy. He was sharp, strategic, and at times, ruthlessly pragmatic. In the late 1180s, the two princes found themselves thrown together by politics and blood. Richard was betrothed to Philip's sister Alice, and both men sought to reclaim Jerusalem from Saladin in what would become the Third Crusade. To prepare, they signed treaties, traveled together, ate at the same tables, slept, according to at least one chronicle, in the same bed. The Chronicle of Roger of Hoveden states, Richard, Duke of Aquitaine, and Philip, King of France, were so close in affection that they ate every day at the same table and from the same dish, and at night their beds did not separate them. Now, in medieval times, sharing a bed was not uncommon for diplomatic or practical reasons. But the intimacy between Richard and Philip went beyond the surface. They laughed together, dined alone together, rode into battle with their banners intertwined. They called each other brothers. Some whispered lovers. Betrayal in the Holy Land. In 1190 the two kings set out on crusade. Together, they laid siege to Acre. Together, they stood under the burning sun, sword in hand, defending the Christian cause. But cracks formed quickly. Richard was admired by the armies. Philip was not. Richard, despite his reputation, made backdoor treaties, claimed cities, and outshone his counterpart at every turn. Philip grew resentful. Then came Cyprus. Richard conquered the island, without consulting Philip, and claimed it as his own. He then married Berengaria of Navarre, abandoning his betrothal to Philip's sister Alice. It was the final insult. Philip left the crusade and returned to France, humiliated and enraged. From that point forward, their alliance shattered. Their friendship soured into rivalry, from lovers to enemies. Back in Europe, the former companions became bitter foes. Philip seized Richard's lands in Normandy. Richard retaliated with war. For years, their armies clashed across the French countryside, undoing the unity once forged under banners of gold and blood. Was it just politics? Or was there heartbreak beneath the armor? Some historians argue their bond was a purely strategic alliance that simply failed. Others believe Richard's spurning of Alice and rising glory struck too close to Philip's heart. A heartbreak that turned into a vendetta. Richard's secrets and silence. Richard the Lionheart died in 1199, struck by a crossbow bolt while besieging a rebellious vassal's castle in France. His final words reportedly expressed forgiveness. But he left no heirs. His marriage had produced no children. His legacy lived through battle songs, not bloodlines. Rumors of his sexuality persisted even in his lifetime. He confessed publicly, once, to sins of the flesh. Some interpreted this as a veiled reference to homosexual behavior, which the church condemned. But he was never formally accused. His greatest emotional alliances were with men, his commanders, his bodyguards, and once perhaps Philip. Philip's revenge and rise. Philip outlived Richard by decades. He grew France's power, dismantled the Angevin empire Richard had built, and became known as one of the greatest kings of France. But he never forged another friendship quite like the one he had with the Lionheart. And he never forgot the man who once shared his campaigns, and maybe his heart. Legacy of a lost bond. The story of Richard and Philip is not one of romantic poetry or tender vows. It is a tale of potential. Love smothered by duty, desire buried beneath strategy, and brotherhood broken by ambition. In medieval chronicles, kings didn't speak of love, especially not love between men. But the silences in their story speak volumes. Because sometimes, the greatest love affairs are those never fully named, and sometimes, what's left unsaid can shape the fate of nations. It began like a fairy tale. A young king of France. A beautiful Bavarian princess. A royal wedding celebrated across Europe. But in the candlelit corners of the French court, fairy tales rarely last. Charles VI of France, once called Le Bien-Aimé, the Beloved, would soon become known as Le Folle, the Mad. And Isabeau of Bavaria, his radiant queen, would face accusations that would tarnish her name for centuries. This is the story of a marriage that began in hope, drowned in illness, and left behind a court so divided, it opened the door to war, betrayal, and the eventual fall of a dynasty. A young and promising King Charles VI ascended the French throne in 1380 at just 11 years old. By the time he turned 20, he had taken full control from his regents, showing signs of a just, chivalrous monarch. He was tall, elegant, and adored by the people. France, scarred by the 100 Years' War and racked with internal division, looked to him for unity. In 1385, he married Isabeau of Bavaria, a young noblewoman chosen for her lineage and charm. She was just 15. Their wedding was a spectacle, a union meant to symbolize peace and prosperity, and for a time, it did. The two shared a tender early bond. They had 12 children, and for the first few years the court flourished under their reign. But then, the shadows came. The madness of a king. In 1392, Charles suffered his first breakdown. While leading an army through a forest, he suddenly became erratic. Sweating, shaking, paranoid. He drew his sword and attacked his own men, killing several. After collapsing, he fell into a coma for days. When he awoke, he remembered nothing. It was the beginning of a terrible decline. Over the years, Charles experienced prolonged bouts of madness. He didn't recognize his wife or children. He believed he was made of glass. He barked like a dog. He ran through the halls of his palace howling with fear. Sometimes he would recover, lucid for months at a time. But the relapses always returned, each one worse than the last. Her queen alone, Isabeau, was still young when her husband's illness took hold. And with the king incapacitated, someone had to rule. She stepped into the void. But France was not kind to ruling women. And Isabeau was not merely a mother or a queen. She became the de facto leader of a shattered monarchy. She formed alliances with Charles, uncle, the powerful Duke of Burgundy. She tried to navigate the constant power struggles between French nobles. She protected her children, she negotiated treaties. But in the eyes of the people, she became a target. Scandal and accusation. As Charles' madness deepened, rumors about Isabeau multiplied. She was accused of being vain, extravagant, selfish, unfaithful. Whispers claimed she took lovers while her husband sat drooling in the throne room. Some said she had an affair with Louis, Duke of Orleans, Charles' own brother. Others, more outrageously, suggested she seduced her own son, the future Charles VII. None of these claims were ever proven. But in medieval Europe, a woman who wielded power was almost always painted as immoral. The image of Isabeau as a villain took root, and the kingdom continued to crumble. Civil war and the collapse of France. France descended into civil war. The Armagnacs, led by Isabeau's alleged lover Louis of Orleans, clashed with the Burgundians, her political allies. Assassinations followed. Cities burned. The English watched with glee. In 1415, at the Battle of Agincourt, France suffered a catastrophic defeat at the hands of Henry V of England. By 1419, Charles was incapable of ruling at all. Isabeau signed the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, a desperate agreement that disinherited her own son, Charles VII, and named Henry V as heir to the French throne. Many saw it as treason, but others saw it for what it was, the act of a mother trying to preserve what remained of her fractured kingdom. The legacy of a marriage in ruin. Charles VI died in 1422, after 30 years of torment. He died insane and broken, a monarch whose golden promise was swallowed by illness. Isabeau lived until 1435, mostly forgotten, reviled, or ignored. But her life, her love for Charles, her struggle for power, her endurance in the face of rumor, was anything but forgettable. She had stood beside a man no longer in his right mind. She had fought for her children in a court that wished her gone. And she had paid the price for a husband's illness with her own reputation. Was she a perfect queen? No. But she was loyal longer than anyone deserved to be. Love, madness, and the silence of history. The marriage of Charles VI and Isabeau is not a tale of infidelity. It's a story of survival. A queen who watched the man she married disappear before her eyes, who had to navigate politics while being blamed for everything that went wrong. She loved a man who no longer knew her name. And still she stayed. That perhaps is the most forbidden kind of love. The kind that cannot be returned, cannot be healed, and cannot be saved. Only endured. Some queens are born in tragedy. Mary Stuart entered the world in 1542 as the only surviving child of James V of Scotland. He died just 6 days after her birth. An infant queen, draped in swaddling instead of silk, already surrounded by war, intrigue, and foreign interests. She would grow into a woman whose life was defined by beauty, politics, religion, and forbidden love. And her most dangerous affair would be with a man whose ambition matched her own, James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. Their passion would ignite rebellion, invite accusation, and end with Mary imprisoned, and ultimately executed. A queen of two kingdoms, Mary was not just Queen of Scots, she had been Queen of France as well. At 16, she married the Dauphin, Francis, and became Queen Consort when he ascended the throne. But Francis died just 2 years later, and Mary, now a widow at 18, returned to a cold and divided Scotland. There, she encountered a kingdom in religious and political turmoil. Scotland was tearing itself apart between Catholics and Protestants, nobles and monarchs, tradition and reform. Into this storm, Mary brought grace, French fashion, and a dangerous legitimacy. She was also a Catholic with a strong claim to the English throne, a threat Queen Elizabeth I of England could never ignore. Mary married again in 1565, this time to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, her English cousin. It was a strategic move, meant to strengthen her claim to the English crown. But Darnley was vain, arrogant, and power-hungry. Their marriage disintegrated into jealousy and mistrust. And then, Darnley died, the death of a king consort. On February 10, 1567, an explosion rocked the Kirkhoe Fieldhouse in Edinburgh, where Darnley had been staying. His body was found in the garden, unburned, but strangled. It was murder. And the whispers began immediately. Some blamed Protestant nobles. Others pointed fingers at Mary herself. But one name rose above the rest: James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. Who was Bothwell? Bothwell was a powerful nobleman, rugged, charismatic, and fiercely loyal to Mary. He had fought for her, defended her. Some said he had already been her lover, even before Darnley's death. He was everything Darnley wasn't: courageous, commanding, decisive. He was also Protestant, which made him a valuable political asset in a country torn by religious division. But his ambitions ran deep, and his path to power would come through the Queen herself. Weeks after Darnley's death, Bothwell was put on trial for the murder, and acquitted. It was widely believed the trial had been rigged. He left the court with his reputation damaged, but legally cleared. Then, something astonishing happened: the Queen's abduction. In April 1567, Mary was travelling to Edinburgh when she was intercepted by Bothwell and a company of armed men. He took her to Dunbar Castle. What happened next remains the subject of furious debate. Mary later claimed she had been kidnapped and possibly raped. Others insisted she went willingly. Whatever the truth, within weeks, they were married. The people were stunned. To many, it looked like the Queen had married her husband's killer. Rebellion and collapse. Mary's marriage to Bothwell was a political catastrophe. The Scottish nobility turned on her. The Protestant lords, outraged by Bothwell's rise, formed an army. The Catholic nobles, alienated by her controversial marriage, withdrew support. Mary and Bothwell faced the Confederate lords in battle at Carberry Hill. They surrendered. Bothwell fled into exile. He would be captured years later and die in a Danish prison, insane and alone. Mary was imprisoned at Loch Leven Castle. She was forced to abdicate in favor of her 1-year-old son, James VI. The Queen, who had once ruled 2 kingdoms, now sat alone, betrayed, imprisoned, and disgraced. Escape and the final fall. Mary escaped captivity in 1568 and fled to England, seeking refuge from her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I. But Elizabeth saw her not as a guest, but as a threat. Mary was placed under house arrest for 19 years. She never saw Bothwell again. She never returned to Scotland. In 1586, she was implicated in a Catholic plot to assassinate Elizabeth and seize the English throne. And on February 8, 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed. She died in red, a Catholic symbol of martyrdom. Legacy of a love too bold. Was Mary complicit in Darnley's murder? Did she love Bothwell? Or was she a pawn, seduced and coerced by a ruthless noble? History doesn't agree. But what cannot be denied is that her love for Bothwell, whether real or forced, marked the point of no return. It shattered her reign. It gave her enemies the justification they needed to depose her, and it turned a queen into a cautionary tale. The queen who loved too much Mary's downfall is often blamed on her heart. She loved recklessly, passionately, with a loyalty that bordered on self-destruction. She was too romantic for her time, too trusting, too bold. But she was also brave, and in the end she died with dignity, knowing that history would remember her not just as a queen, but as a woman who loved, ruled, and fell. All for a man who couldn't hold the throne. She gave everything to protect. Few names in history are as synonymous with scandal as Borgia. The very word conjures images of velvet-draped conspiracies, poison hidden in rings, and forbidden trysts whispered through candlelit corridors. At the center was Rodrigo Borgia, who rose to become Pope Alexander VI, a man more known for his mistresses and illegitimate children than for his theology. And among those children was Lucrezia. Beautiful, educated, politically savvy, and relentlessly vilified. Was she an innocent pawn in her family's ambitions? Or the cunning seductress that rumors claimed? And did her most forbidden affair involve the very man who called himself the Vicar of Christ? The rise of a family. The Borgias were Spanish by birth but Roman by ambition. Rodrigo Borgia climbed the clerical ladder with relentless energy. He became a cardinal, then vice-chancellor of the church. And finally, in 1492 he purchased, through bribes and influence, the papacy itself. As Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo ruled not as a spiritual father, but as a Renaissance prince. He hosted orgies in the Vatican. He enriched his family through titles and land. And he never pretended to be celibate. He openly acknowledged his children, something almost unthinkable for a pope. Among them his favorite was Lucrezia, the perfect daughter. Or something more. Lucrezia was born in 1480. From a young age she was praised for her intelligence, poise and beauty. Her father adored her, and perhaps, too much. The whispers began when she was still a teenager. That her father was possessive. That their affection crossed boundaries. That their relationship was not merely paternal. There was no direct proof. But the rumors refused to die. Some claimed Lucrezia bore a child whose parentage was untraceable. A mysterious infant Juan was documented in Vatican ledgers, his origins never confirmed. Was he Rodrigo's son, or Lucrezia's, or both? The marriages that mattered. Lucrezia was married 3 times. Each union was arranged for political gain. Each ended in scandal. Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro. Their marriage was annulled after the Borgia family accused him of impotence. Sforza retaliated by accusing Lucrezia of incest, with both her brother, Cesare, and her father, the Pope. Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Bisegli. He was charming, young, and truly in love with Lucrezia. But when his political value waned, he was murdered, almost certainly by Cesare's men. Some say Lucrezia tried to save him. Others say she helped plan it. Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara. This final marriage was more stable, though not without tension. The Este family initially resisted the union, wary of Lucrezia's reputation, the papal mistress, the political pawn. During her father's reign, Lucrezia served as more than daughter. She acted as regent when the Pope was away. She managed correspondence with foreign leaders. She hosted lavish Vatican events. And when Rodrigo died in 1503, she retreated from public life, taking with her secrets that no chronicler could fully unearth. Was she her father's confidant? His lover? A puppet of the papacy, or simply a woman born into a family so notorious that her every move was interpreted as sin? The truth behind the myths. Modern historians have worked hard to untangle the legend of Lucrezia from the woman herself. There is no definitive evidence of incest. No written confession, no concrete proof, but the rumors say as much about the world she lived in as they do about her. In Renaissance Italy, women with power, especially beautiful ones, were rarely forgiven for their ambition. Lucrezia became a canvas for every fear the world had about women's sex and influence, and because she was a Borgia, her sins were magnified tenfold. The lover Pope Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, was never celibate, that much is known. He had multiple mistresses, including Vannozza de Catane, Lucrezia's mother, and later Giulia Farnese, who was rumored to live with him in the Vatican. His enemies, many of them within the church, used his personal life to discredit his spiritual authority, but Rodrigo did not care. He lavished gifts upon Lucrezia. He protected her fiercely. He arranged her marriages as if they were state affairs, and in doing so he blurred every boundary between papacy and parenthood. Was his love for Lucrezia paternal, obsessive, erotic, perhaps all three, perhaps none? What mattered was perception, and in the court of Rome, perception could be fatal. Death and redemption. Lucrezia died in 1519 at just 39, likely due to complications from childbirth. In her later years she reinvented herself as a patron of the arts, a respected duchess, and a devout woman. She funded churches, employed poets, commissioned religious works, but the stains of her youth clung to her memory. Even today she is portrayed as a seductress, a poisoner, a femme fatale. And the truth may lie somewhere in between. Legacy of a forbidden daughter. Lucrezia Borgia's story is one of survival in a world that punished women for the sins of men. Her name became legend not because of what she did, but because of what others feared she had done. And as for the man who may have loved her too much, Pope Alexander VI died gasping for breath, poisoned, some say, by his own concoctions. His enemies rejoiced. The church distanced itself, but his legacy lives on, in every whisper of the Borgia name, and in every forbidden love that hides behind a crown. In an era where queens were expected to be silent symbols of obedience, Marguerite of Valois defied expectation at every turn. She was brilliant, charismatic, and beautiful beyond measure. But what made Margot legendary was not her lineage, nor her crown, but her lovers, her unapologetic sexuality, her refusal to bend to a world that demanded shame, married into a political nightmare, trapped between Catholic and Protestant bloodshed. Margot found power in her lovers, and scandal in her heart, but it was not merely pleasure she sought, it was freedom, and that freedom would come at a cost. The daughter of Catherine de' Medici, Marguerite was born in 1553, the daughter of one of Europe's most formidable queens, Catherine de' Medici. Catherine ruled behind the scenes with cunning and calculation. Her daughter, however, possessed a different kind of power, one rooted in allure, intelligence and rebellion. Educated in philosophy, fluent in Latin, and steeped in politics from childhood, Marguerite was destined to play a role in shaping France. But she would not play it quietly. The wedding that became a massacre at age 19, Marguerite was married to Henry of Navarre, a Protestant nobleman, and distant heir to the French throne. The marriage was meant to bring peace between France's warring Catholic and Huguenot factions. Instead, it triggered one of the bloodiest events in French history. Just days after the wedding in Paris, the Saint Bartholomew's Day massacre began. Thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered in the streets, many of them wedding guests. The air reeked of blood and betrayal. The city became a charnel house. Marguerite herself reportedly saved several men from death by hiding them in her quarters, even as bodies piled outside her windows. Her marriage, meant to symbolize unity, became a curse. Her husband was spared, but only after he converted to Catholicism under duress. And Margot? She was trapped. A loveless marriage. The union between Marguerite and Henry of Navarre was political, not personal. He was ambitious, restless, and frequently unfaithful. So was she. Within months of their wedding, Marguerite resumed a relationship with Joseph Boniface de la Mole, a dashing nobleman whose love letters still survive. Their affair scandalized the court. It also nearly cost them both their lives. La Mole was implicated in a plot to assassinate Marguerite's brother, King Charles IX. Whether he was guilty or not, the punishment was swift and brutal. He was tortured, executed, and his severed head, legend says, was preserved in a box by Margot, who mourned him for years. She would not be his last lover, nor his only rival. A queen of many lovers, Margot refused to live in the shadow of male betrayal. If her husband could stray, so could she. She had numerous lovers throughout her life, some noble, some not. Their names filled the gossip sheets of Paris. Their presence at her court enraged her enemies. But her lovers were more than romantic partners. They were spies, confidants, protectors. She used them as pawns, as shields, and sometimes as swords. Margot's sexuality was not weakness, it was strategy. And in a world where her brothers ruled through blood, she ruled through charm. Exile and independence. By the 1580s, Marguerite had become a liability to her family. Her political maneuvering, her affairs, and her open disdain for her arranged marriage led to her imprisonment. She was confined in the fortress of Usson for 18 years. But exile did not silence her. In Usson, she transformed her prison into a court of art, literature, and scandal. She hosted philosophers, wrote poetry, and maintained a network of informants and allies. And she kept her lovers. Even in isolation, Queen Margot remained defiantly herself. The return of the Queen in 1599, Henry of Navarre, now King Henry IV of France, officially annulled their marriage to remarry and produce an heir. Marguerite agreed, on the condition that she be restored to her titles and given financial security. She returned to Paris not as a disgraced queen, but as a living legend. In her final years, she became a patron of the arts, a fashion icon, and an unofficial advisor to the Bourbon court. She remained unmarried, unrepentant, unforgettable. The memoirs of Marguerite's memoirs, written near the end of her life, are among the first by a woman in European history. They are bold, reflective, and unapologetic. She recounts her lovers, her exile, her political maneuvers, not with shame, but with pride. She does not deny her affairs, she justifies them. She presents herself not as a victim of circumstance, but as a woman who lived as she pleased, despite the world around her. Legacy of a scandalous Queen Marguerite of Valois shattered the mold of the medieval queen. She loved many, and loved well. She made mistakes, she paid for them. But she never surrendered her identity to the expectations of a crown. And in doing so she became something rare in history. A woman remembered not for who she married, but for who she dared to be. A queen of lovers. A lover of freedom. A legend, draped in silk, holding a mirror to the hypocrisies of her age. What is forbidden love truly? Is it the heat of a stolen kiss in a candlelit corridor? Is it the tear-soaked silence of a queen watching her lover led to the gallows? Or is it the quiet, smoldering fury of knowing that power cannot protect the heart? Throughout this journey we've walked the echoing halls of Europe's most haunted castles. We've watched kings lose their thrones, queens their crowns, and empires their heirs, all in the name of love they were never allowed to claim. But behind the armor, the robes, the veils, and the Latin prayers, they were just human. Just hearts, beating a little too loudly in rooms where silence was survival. The cost of desire. What do all these stories have in common? Eleanor of Aquitaine, who challenged one king and seduced another, shifting the balance of power between France and England. Abelard and Heloise, whose love was punished not just with steel but with silence, their bodies imprisoned, even as their letters soared across the centuries. Guinevere and Lancelot, whose love brought down a mythic utopia and turned brotherhood into betrayal. Isabella of France, the she-wolf who overthrew her husband and ruled with her lover, only to watch him hang. Henry and Anne, Edward and Jane, Philip and his scandalous court. Mary, Queen of Scots, who risked everything for the wrong man. Richard the Lionheart and Philip of France, whose friendship may have been a flame that history was too afraid to name. And Lucrezia Borgia, forever tainted by rumors she did not write. Each affair, each forbidden kiss didn't just cost reputations, it cost legacies. Bloodlines. Empires. The weight of the crown. To wear a crown was to live in a cage. Royal love was never truly free. Marriages were treaties. Children were pawns. Husbands were monarchs. Wives were wombs. Mistresses were currency. So when passion bloomed, wild, untamed, it was like fire in a dry forest. And fire doesn't ask permission to burn. For some, love was a rebellion. For others, it was survival. And for a few, it was destruction incarnate. Because in the medieval world, to love the wrong person was to challenge God. And kingdoms, like cathedrals, do not tolerate heresy. The lovers who ruled in the shadows. Some of these lovers never touched. Some ruled empires from behind closed doors, some left behind children, letters, or ghost stories. But none left the world unchanged. Abelard and Heloise gave us some of the most powerful love letters in history, written from cloisters and cells, bleeding with honesty and pain. Anne Boleyn gave us Elizabeth I. Eleanor of Aquitaine gave us 2 dynasties. Marguerite of Valois gave us a memoir so bold it still defies expectation centuries later. And others, like Blanche, Margaret, and Jane Shore, gave only their silence. Their stories were rewritten, their reputations ruined. Because history is not always kind to women who feel too deeply. Especially when their love makes kings fall.